Hello, Unity travelers, and welcome. Uh, in the last video, we discussed anchors uh, for UI, and in this video, we're going to start adding UI objects to our login page. This is a series for creating a login page. Uh, there are 3 videos before this one. Make sure to go and watch those, otherwise this video might not make complete sense, especially if you're a beginner. So to start, we have our background and our canvas. I'm going to toggle this arrow and then select the background. And I'm going to start adding our UI objects as children of this background. And I like to work this way because I like to think that all children objects are in front of the parent objects. So since the background is going to always be in the back, we can start adding our child objects as children to that background. So I'm going to right click on background, select the UI tab, and select image. I'm going to create an image object, and I'm going to rename it to logo. And then I'm going to move this up, and you can just select and drag, and I'm not pressing anything except left mouse button here to move it. And then also something else I want to point out. If you don't see these 4 blue circles on the corners, it's likely because you are in the Move tool, which will still work in UI, but a lot of times when you're working in UI, you care more about the Rect tool, which allows you to resize objects easier for UI. So that's how you switch to the Rect tool. And here I can also set a specific position rather than dragging it, and I will set it to 170. And then note also our anchors at the moment are centered. Since our object is going to be in the top center, I actually want to switch our anchors to the top center. This is not required at all if you're not changing the size of the canvas later. I just prefer to do this for organization reasons. I know that it's 70 units from the top. That might be a little nicer to look at than just 170 units from the center, 70 units from the top, or I don't know. It seems more understandable. And then the other reason you would do this is if you do change your canvas size, this object will move or will adjust based on where its anchors are. So if the anchors are at the top center, that's where it's going to try to reposition itself when you adjust the canvas size. Okay. So we have this blank square. That's because we haven't added an image yet to our image component, and I will go through the details of this in a second. But for now, I want you to go to Assets, and here I will create a folder. Well, I already have, but I'll show you how to create a folder. Create and then folder. So right-click, create folder. And I called it images. It's just for my personal organization. And then now I'm going to import a new asset. Again, that was right-click and then import new asset. And here I have my logo asset. And so now well, first let's go through looking at this asset. So at the moment, this asset is a texture. It's 2D. And for the purposes of this login page, we actually want it to be a sprite. So for our image component, image components require sprites, not textures, except for a raw image component. That's a different story. That would require a texture. So I'm just going to go through some of these real quick. So sprite mode, let's say you have a sprite sheet. So you have a bunch of sprites in one PNG. Then you can switch the sprite mode to multiple, and that will allow you with the sprite editor I can show you that real quick. Okay, well, I guess you'd need to download an extra tool for the sprite editor, so we won't do that right now. But with the sprite editor, you could split that up into pieces, and that would allow you to basically create a bunch of sprites from one PNG, which is also extremely efficient. So I highly suggest doing that instead of creating a PNG for each separate sprite. A sprite sheet is much better. And then the rest of this doesn't matter. So I'm just going to hit apply. It is now a sprite. And so if I go back to logo, I can either click on this little radio button and select Unity Traveler, or usually a much easier way is to just drag it into that source image field. So now we have our sprite image. You can see here is our image. So let me go through this image component and talk about what you can do with this component. So this Unity Traveler logo, so this is the source image. This is where you change images. We just did something. We just added an image there. Color. So this is a tint. It allows you to tint your image. You can see I'm tinting it. But notice it is a tint. It's not actually coloring in things like specific parts of the image. You don't really have a choice what it colors. It's just tinting the entire image. So if you want to add color in specific places or change your image, you have to do that outside of Unity. You cannot do that just by this tint. But for, if I wanted this whole thing to have a reddish hue, I could do that with the tint. I'm just going to leave it white though. And the only other thing that I feel is important for this video is preserve aspect. So you can see the size changed a tiny bit. So this is 100 by 100. And if you look down here, you can see our image is actually 1000 by 970. So 100 by 100 when it's scaled down is not going to be the same aspect ratio as 1000 by 970. So this preserve aspect ratio button just essentially shrinks the image to the least amount possible to preserve the aspect ratio. So that's why we see that little shrink. But if I did make it 1000 by 970, and this is going to be huge, you would see the aspect ratio does not actually need to shrink at all, and preserve aspect isn't actually doing anything. So, okay. So we have our logo. The width did not change for some reason. There we go. So yeah, that's it for the image component. Something I would like to note, in general, best practice is to create images in sizes of power of 2 if possible. So this is actually not a good sprite, but for the most part, especially if you're developing for PC, it should be able to run fast enough that this shouldn't be an issue. But it can be expensive with a lot of sprites that have to convert to power of 2. So it's better if you just import images already in power of 2. Okay, so we've already got our nice logo at the start of, or at the top of our login page. Let's add a couple other components. So again, I'm going to select background, right click, UI, and let's add a text component. You'll see there's two options here. There's text and text mesh pro. I would say 99% of the time you should just use text mesh pro. It's more efficient, it looks nicer, and it's just better in almost every way. There are very rare cases where you would rather use the old Unity text rather than text mesh pro. So I'm going to add text mesh pro object. It will require you to import some assets or some assets for TextMesh Pro. I suggest you need to do that to use it. You don't need to do these examples and extras, but if you choose to look into TextMesh Pro more about how it works, this is probably a good place to start. I'm going to close that. And so now we've got our text. So here is our TextMesh Pro component. The first thing you can do is change what the text says. So I'm going to change this to login. Let's go through some of these features. So text style, this will put your text into some pre-made or preset settings, essentially. I almost never use that because I want it to look a certain way. And I have more control if I just edit it myself. So font asset, you can choose different font assets. These two are almost exactly the same, so you're not going to notice much difference. Creating a font asset is pretty easy in Unity. I'm not going to go through it in this video, but look into that if you want your own font. Font styles, let's make this bold since it's a header, and we can also make it underlined. Font size, you can either set the font size automatically or you can just have it auto size to your to the size of your text field, so you'll see it starts resizing. It does have a min and a max as well, just in case you have UI that is changing or text that is changing, and you only want it to be able to make it so small before it just cuts off text. So for an example, this is login text. You can see that it's going to just keep resizing. Let's say I put the min at 38, and let's say I disable or change that. You'll see it starts cutting off until I reduce the number of letters where it can fit. Otherwise, it just starts cutting off. So let me change this, and I'll explain what I just did there in a second. So I'm going to go back to calling this login, and we can leave on auto size for now. And I'm just going to position this here. The anchors, again, I think in this case, I want it to be at the top. Okay. Color, you can change the font color. This is pretty self-explanatory what it does. I'm going to make it black here. Let's talk about alignment. Let me just make this longer actually so you can see alignment. So right now it's aligned to left. This is center and right. I'm just going to do center alignment, and then the same for this is aligned to the top, middle, and bottom. So these are pretty easy to understand. Let me move it back. I'm also going to reduce the font size myself. I don't like it that big. Okay, and then let's talk about wrapping and overflow. So wrapping, if I have multiple lines of text, this is login. You'll see that it is wrapping right now. If I disable wrapping, it will not wrap. And then overflow. If you truncate overflow, it will truncate anything that is too big for the text box. So most of the time, almost all the time, you don't want to truncate. Usually you want to overflow because you want to know, if your text field is too small, and then you can just resize it. But in certain cases, maybe you have a messaging system, and if the message is too long sometimes, then maybe you want to truncate it. Whereas other times, if the full message fits, then maybe you would just want to show the whole message. So maybe in that case, you would want to truncate. But that's an example. Anyways, let's go back to login. And yeah, that's all that's important for TextMesh Pro. So now I'm going to rename this to login title. let's add our text fields that we can type into to log in with. Those are called input fields in Unity. And again, just use TextMesh Pro most of the time. So I'm going to use TextMesh Pro. And I will call this username. So here we have our username field. Just going to move this down real quick to something like that. And it's called username here. And so input field, let's go through what an input field is made up of. It has an image. This is that background that you see, the white background. Here's the input field component. Let's go through the important features of this. So interactable, if you disable it, you'll see it actually has a transition or a color change to show that it's disabled. That's what interactable does. It just means that it's disabled, and it will actually set the background to this disabled color that you choose here. So if I change this, you'll see that's the color that it's using. Okay, let's leave it interactable though. Transitions. So this is color tint. So normal color is what it is now. Highlighted is when you hover over it. Pressed is when you press, mouse click, whatever controller you're using. Selected is after you've pressed and released. This is the color it will be. And then disabled, like you saw, was when I set the interactable to false. There are some other transition states, like sprite swap. And here it's the same same states, highlighted, pressed, selected, disabled, but you can use a sprite change instead of just a tint. So for example, let's say I do something stupid and set the Unity Traveler logo to show up when it's highlighted. If I hit play and I hover it, you'll see the Unity Traveler logo actually loads up there. And we're also noticing the screen is a lot smaller because I had my aspect ratio to 1920 by 1080. So just for the benefit of this video, I'm going to switch it back to free aspect. Okay, so you can see, actually, it's probably easier to see now that I switched back to free aspect. You can see it's trying to load that Unity logo with a sprite swap, which obviously looks terrible. And then finally there's animation. Again, same fields, but in this case, you would create an animation, which is a separate video in itself, but you create an animation that would allow you to, or create multiple animations that you switch between depending on the state. So we're going to leave it on color tint. That's what it is by default. Let's scroll down to some of these other fields. So this is the text that's inside the input field. You'll see it's blank, and I know here you can see it says enter text. So why is it blank here, but it says enter text here? Well, because that enter text is actually this placeholder component. So normally when you type into an input field on like a web page, you have this text, this grayed out text that appears to kind of tell you what the point is of that input field. And then as soon as you start typing, it disappears. And if you delete all the text in the input field, it reappears. So that's what this is. It's a placeholder text. So I could do something like username to help the user know, oh, this is where I put in my username. And then if I actually started typing text, you'd see it disappears, and in goes my the text that I typed, which we will be doing this part through during play. But so yeah, I'm just gonna leave that blank. You can change the font size. I'm actually going to make it a little bigger because I don't like the default. You can set a character limit. If it's set to 0, there is no character limit. Oops. But, let's say your username can only be 14 characters. That's how you would do that. content type. So this is a great way to choose the specific input that's allowed. So if my username can only be I want it to be a name or something like that, or maybe my username is supposed to be an email address. That's kind of how you select a content type. We'll actually be doing this in a second with password, but we'll leave it standard for username. And you can allow multi-line with this, but most of the time, single line for input is ideal. So we'll leave that. The rest of this I'm not going to change, but I will show you this part right here. We'll go into this when we go into the code, so the functionality, but a brief overview. These are callbacks, and these get called when you do things, or what you add functions to these fields, and those functions get called whenever you do something to the input field. So this one occurs whenever you change any value. So if you type any key into the input field, it's going to proc this callback. On and edit, whenever you hit submit or you finish editing your input field, it's going to call this. On select, as soon as you select the input field, and on deselect, as soon as you deselect the input field. Okay, so we'll go into those more later though, or in the next video. So we have our username field. We want a password field, but I pretty much want to keep the exact same look, and I instead of having to right click UI, create another input field text mesh pro, and do the exact same things to it that I did to this field. Instead, we can just right click and we can do duplicate, or Control C, Control V. Either one works. You'll notice though that it did not position itself inside background, so I'm just going to drop it into background. And then again, I'm going to move this to something like this. And these arrows represent the where this navigation, you can see it's set to visualize. This is visualizing how moving up and down or left and right or whatever with your keyboard is going to work. So if you leave this on, you can see down is going to go here, up is going to go to there, kind of what you'd want. So by default, it already does this. If you want to set it yourself, you can use explicit, and you can explicitly say, which I should actually rename this real quick so it's a little clearer. You can explicitly say, I want username. Let me go back and set this one also to explicit. I want username on down to select password, and I want password on up to select username. So see, you see the same arrows. This is just an explicit way to do that, but I'm going to go back to horizontal, vertical, automatic. Yeah, actually, you can just set automatic. Oops, just automatic. There we go. So most of the time you'll just want automatic, but let's say, for example, you are trying to create an application for a console. Automatic might not work so well because you don't have your normal input, with the arrow keys or keyboard mouse. And so in that case, you might want explicit. Okay, so password. We duplicated it, but we need to remember to change placeholder to password. And we also need to make sure that we set the content type to password. And so what does this do by setting it to password? Well, when you start typing, you'll see that it creates those stars for you, which most people are used to when they're typing in a password. So there we go. We've got a very basic start to our UI. One thing that I suggest to do, well, first, something really important I need to discuss, and this is an issue I see a lot. This event system object. What is an event system? It's essentially this object. This object is how all of your UI input, UI clicking functionality. This 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 object and these components need to be in your scene for those things to happen. So if you notice that you try to click a button or you try to type into an input field and none of that is happening, you very likely are missing this event system. So I see this all the time. It happened to me when I was first starting out too a lot, is you're missing an event system and nothing's working. To create a new event system, it's really easy. Like if I delete this one, just right click, UI, event system. You don't need to change anything unless you have some specific settings for an event system, but you don't need to change anything. Your event system should be created automatically when your canvas is created. But if you delete it by accident somewhere along the way, nothing will work. So keep that in mind. So in this event system, the thing I wanted to talk about is it's good to set your first selected. You don't have to do this, but it's nice so that when the application starts, something is already selected. If you don't do this, then the user will, it's fine. They'll just have to click on whatever they want to select. So it's a preference thing. It's up to you. I'm going to set the first selected to username so that when I hit play, username should be first selected. Yeah, there you go. It's already selected, so I can start typing my username. Okay, and then the last big thing for our login page that we need is a submit button. So I'm going to create a button, and once again, TextMesh Pro, we don't need to use the regular button. And I'm going to drag this down to here. There we go. And you can see the navigation is already set up nicely. And let's call this submit. And let's change the text on it to say submit. And this is the same text component, TextMesh Pro component that we had for login. And then we're going to change this. Well, no, we don't actually need to change the name of that. I did want to change the color of the background so that it looks like a little more like a submit button, and maybe make the text white instead of black. Maybe that's too. Well, whatever. Okay, we'll do something like that. Okay, there's our not somewhat crappy submit button. I'm actually gonna resize it a little bit, make it a little bigger, and I think I'll do the same for these. Let's just if you want to copy some information from one object to another, a very easy way to do that is to click on these three dots, copy component. So this is going to copy literally everything in this component. This is the rect transform. So this is the position and sizing component. And then you do the same three dots on the other object that you want to paste that into, and you can paste the values. You'll see it moved up, but it did also copy the sizing. So I'm just going to move it back down. And that looks good to me. The only thing I don't like now is I don't like that the username and password are aligned at the top. The way to fix that, we're going to have to do that in the text objects themselves. If you want to change multiple objects at the same time, you can shift left click. And so now I'm selecting these two objects. Now they have to have the same components, otherwise you won't be able to edit them at the same time. But these both have text components. So right now I'm editing both the placeholder, so that password ... and the text, which the text is our main text that will overwrite the password ... And I'm just going to use the middle alignment. So it's going to align both of those. I'm going to do the same for username. Select both, select the middle alignment, and now that looks a lot better. Okay, great. And so let's go over our submit button now. So it has an image. That's what I was editing to change the color. That's just the background. The button itself, let's talk about that. Again, it has the same transition, so I'm not going to go over that again. Let's talk about this though. So this, again, is another callback, and this callback happens on click. So this is where your functionality goes for clicking on your button. Okay, so in the next video, when we go through functionality, this is the big key thing to remember to make sure your button does something. And that's all for our button component. We don't really need to do anything else. And so now we have the most basic UI, and we really don't need much else for our login page. You can add more if you want, but that went through a lot of the important UI components. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to go through the functionality and through the code to make this login page do something. So thanks for watching, and make sure to watch the next video to make a functioning login page.